more full discussion of this account. I think it's in my ethics series, where I talk about the distinctions between sort of command, right? Plato says, he asks the question, he says, is an action right because God commands it, which is this? The rightness of an act is a consequence of God commanding the act. Or does God command the act because the act in and of itself is right? The distinction between these 2 points is that this mode of understanding morality, if you will, the rightness of a moral action, is, as we can see, independent. Right? It's independent to the command of God because God commands the act, because the act in and of itself is right. So the act in and of itself is right. It is the right thing to do. God recognizes that the act in and of itself is the right thing to do, and therefore the rightness of the act is what causes God, right? It antecedes the command. The other way is to say that the rightness of the act is a consequence of God's commandment. Well, we can't make sense. This is dependent. And dependent and independent refers to morality. This is morally independent, and this is morally dependent. The morality of the action, the rightness of the action, is itself dependent on God's command, right? The rightness of the action, the morality of the action, is itself dependent on God's command. So you don't know whether or not the action is right or not until you've heard the command of God. This also means that God's commandment in and of itself is the conceptual foundational framework with which we make sense of our moral actions. God can't command something that's wrong. Everything that God commands is right, even if God commands contradictory commands. So, for example, and I've said this before in a different lecture series, if God says, thou shalt not kill as a commandment, but he commands Abraham to slaughter his son Isaac, which we know how that ends, he doesn't, the angel intervenes, but he gave the command, thou shalt not kill on one hand. Killing is immoral on one hand, but he told Abraham to kill. If Abraham would have completed the act and killed his infant son, his action would have been moral, right? Why would it have been moral? Because the morality of the action is contingent on the dependency of God's command. Actually, I just jumped right into the... Can I make that any simpler? Eschatology is a bit conceptually abstract. The idea being that God can command contradictory stances, and both stances, to kill and not to kill, are both moral actions. Obviously, this is arguably to a secularist littered with contradiction, littered with confusions. The number one claim is that no particular moral agent will know whether an action is right unless they know for a fact that God commanded the act. Now, with respect to our discussion of fundamentalism, this is really what fundamentalism refers to on a very technical level, right? When we're talking about fundamentalist theology, we recognize that fundamentalist theology is sort of represented by this, right? The action is right. The rightness, the correctness, the morality of an action is a consequence of God commanding the act, right? A fundamentalist theological approach says, at least from this account, there's many other things that we will see historically and conceptually that incorporate into this idea of fundamentalism. But you hear fundamentalism in contemporary news, and maybe one thing I can contribute to the discourse is that you hear fundamentalists, whether it's fundamentalist Islamic belief, fundamentalist Christian belief. Here in the States, it's a lot of fundamentalist Christian belief discourse. You think extremist, right? And the idea of extremists, for whatever bizarre reason in the 21st century, is immediately conflated with terrorism or hostility or radical extremism. Technically speaking, from an academic standpoint, all that it means fundamentally, right, the word fundamentalism, is that the devotee believes that the rightness, the morality of an action is a consequence of God commanding the act. So you could look at this in layman terms as saying a literal interpretation. There are varying degrees of the literacy of the literal nature of the interpretation, but the idea is if God says it, if God says that this is what you ought to do, then that is what you ought to do. Under all historical times, irrespective of social differences or historical situatedness, God said you ought to do X, that means you got to do X, right? The idea that is not necessarily antithetical, but different, a different interpretation and not fundamentalist, is more of this moral independency, right? The morality of an action, the rightness of an action exists independently to God's command. This is not an account of fundamentalist theology. The fundamentalist theological devotee believes that the morality or the rightness, the morality and the rightness of an act is itself contingent on the commandment from God. Okay, so that's the first sort of branch of the tree, right? And basically all this means is that the rightness or morality of an action is a consequence of God's command. Okay, first part. This is not presented in the text. This is me giving you information so that you can approach the text, right? I just need to sort of set the conceptual stage, which is actually a little abstract, so that once we progress through all of this discourse, you'll have a better understanding of what fundamentalism really is, and not this, oh, it's, terrorism and radical extremists. It's not that at all. It means that the word is taken literal, right? What God says is a just act, and the justness, the rightness, the morality of the act is contingent on God's command. The next thing to recognize is very, very important, right? That we can talk about this with respect to two different branches, right? Direct and indirect revelation. We can have a direct, so the two parts of the branch, the first part, and we need both of these to have a full understanding, right? The first thing is a conceptual recognition of what fundamentalist theology is, which I've explained, I think, sort of ad nauseum already. You should be very clear as to the dependency of the claim, the conceptual dependency of the claim. The next is to recognize the distinction between direct or indirect revelation. Insofar as we have direct revelation, it is the revelation from God himself to the devotee. God speaks directly to the potential messenger, prophet, what have you, and gives the command to the devotee, him or herself, directly. There's no in-between, there's no liaison between the command of God and the individual or the institution or the group that will carry out the command, right? So we have sort of, the idea is from God's mouth to my ear, right? This is the devotee, right? So God gives the devotee the command, right? And insofar as God gives the devotee the command, we recognize that the rightness or the wrongness of the act, we see the rightness or wrongness is going to be itself a consequence of God giving us the command, right? So God commands action X, whatever it is, commands A-C-T, commands action X, and the devotee performs action X. Right? God commands X, the devotee performs X because it was a direct revelation. God directly revealed the truth, directly revealed the command to the devotee. In antiquity, this happened all the time, right? In many, many different religious texts. I know the Christian text better than I know Islamic texts, and better than I know Judaic texts. So a lot of my discourse is going to be situated just because of lack of understanding on my part. I am this year learning more about Islamic belief systems, Judaic belief systems. I'm reading their respective religious texts just so that I have a better understanding of the material. Again, I mean, I'm a lover of information, and these are three of the most powerful books, three of the most powerful ideological systems in creation. So it would be stupid for me not to try and access and try to come to understand these religious traditions for what they really are, right? The idea is, at least in antiquity this happened frequently. It doesn't happen as much now, or the occurrence of it happening now is a lot more